Gacha games are incredibly difficult to get right. If you're looking at some of the most well-known and most popular ones, you have Azur Lane, Arknights, Blue Archive to an extent, I'm just mentioning that because I primarily cover it, Punishing Grey Raven, Honkai Impact, Genshin Impact, Tower of Fantasy, though that was more briefly, and Epic 7. Each of these do have their own varieties. I'm not going to mention Fate Go just because I don't play that and I don't want to speak on that game, so I'm just going to mention the ones I've at least touched. And one of the core difficulties with a gacha game is getting the right balance of a good introduction that actually keeps you hooked or at least intrigued into the story, a good and fluid combat system to the extent to where you actually want to put investment into your units. An example could be Arknights with the leveling and building of an entire team. You could have something like Blue Archive in the leveling and building of your formation of units, specifically in regards to the weaknesses of your opponents. You could have something like Genshin Impact, Honkai Impact, etc. There are so many different varieties of combat styles and systems that it wouldn't be fair to just list them all together and group them in one sitting, simply because of the different takes and different styles they all utilize. Arknights takes tower defense, whereas Blue Archive has a much more chibi art style in which you essentially just let the game autoplay while you occasionally use skills, though you can make that autoplay as well. Genshin Impact, Honkai Impact, Tower of Fantasy, Azur Lane do all have a much more involved combat system, though it is a bit iffy. With Azur Lane, you can set it to autoplay, and with Genshin, Tower of Fantasy, and Honkai Impact, as well as Punishing Grey Raven, you are much more involved, though there are different ways to mitigate your amount of playing, and some require more attention than others. With all of that being said, one of the most difficult aspects of a gacha game is giving you something intriguing and interesting to attach and latch onto in the beginning stages of the game. I've oftentimes said that Arknights has a very slow beginning, a beginning to an extent that I don't like. It's taken me out of the game many times. And I still hold true to that statement. Arknights, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily have a good beginning. The beginning overloads you with a lot of text and a lot of information that at that moment you don't necessarily care about. So it's very difficult to pull you in when I have no context, no reason to care, and really nothing going for it that would make me read those walls of text or the paragraphs that are being presented to me. But a slow start is still better than just no start at all, and Arknights is an amazing gacha game. Despite how I've mentioned that I may not like the story, or at least how it's presented early on, Arknights is one of the best gacha games I've played. The combat style and strategy involved really makes you want to learn how to play better, makes you want to remember the stages, how enemies are going to file in, where the choke points are that you can actively set up in, and makes you consider your team compositions really, really well. I think that a game that can really put the story or other context in the background and make you focus instead on your knowledge of the game, make you want to improve more as an operator or as a leader in this scenario, does a really good job at intriguing you. The gacha aspect and how many characters you have or how many characters you're rolling for really falls into the background to the extent to where you are more than happy and more than capable of playing with the characters that the game gives you naturally. Not to mention the fact that the game is pretty generous and does essentially give you the ability to pick operators here and there. And if you're starting as a new player, you already have a voucher, two of which that can allow you to pick up a character at any point in time. So if we're excluding the generosity of the developers, you have a really solid foundation. Arknights is a great game. Arknights has a great and solid soundtrack, both for events and just in the standard game alone. The community and fanbase is wide and vast to an extent to where it's incredibly difficult to look up something and not find a guide or a video focusing down on it. So I think if you're like me and maybe you didn't give Arknights a big enough chance early on because the introduction wasn't your thing, or maybe the story itself didn't present itself in a way that really drew you in, give it a second chance. Either start up a brand new account or watch YouTube videos on it. If you're someone who's played MMOs like Final Fantasy or Destiny, you know that the beginning is oftentimes the worst simply because you don't have an investment yet, but I think the later on stages do really exemplify that fact. I think if you are willing to get through the beginning of Arknights, pay attention and watch the story or read it or however you choose to do it, the payoff for that is much, much better. I don't think Arknights is a game that a lot of individuals say is just great just because. Arknights does have great gameplay. Arknights does have great design, great aesthetics, great character design, great music, and a good story. I just think the beginning of that story needs a little bit of work. And maybe it's not for everybody. So I have personally decided to give Arknights a second chance. I'm going through the story slowly. I'm trying to read through everything to get a better understanding of the situation, of the characters I'm meeting, and of everybody's relationship to one another. And yes, it's slow going. Ultimately, though, it does take a lot of reading, a lot of effort. And considering Arknights has a lot of words in it, it is going to be a lot of effort. But I believe that ultimately at the end of that journey, with the knowledge that I have gained from reading the story and from paying attention to events, this new information coming forward is going to mean a lot more, and it's going to allow me to better understand the situation. And I want to be able to at least speak knowledgeably on this story of Arknights. With that being said, there are a variety of gacha games that don't necessarily have the strongest start, but usually make up for it in other ways, similar to Arknights. An example of a game that doesn't necessarily have the best start is Blue Archive. I talk about this game quite a lot. I love this game, but the beginning isn't exactly the most intriguing. A lot of information is told to you and a lot of things happen, but the presentation isn't necessarily the best that really pulls you in because you're not given something to latch onto. Now keep in mind, both of these games have way better presentation and way better beginnings than Tower of Fantasy. I played Tower of Fantasy and my god, that was the worst beginning I think I've ever had in a game. But even with that being said, Arknights, Blue Archive, Genshin Impact, Honkai Impact, Punishing Graven, there are so many different games that you can essentially ignore the story if the gameplay and gameplay loop is extremely good, or the character designs. If you're really just simping out for units, hey, they're perfectly fine. And I think that having a game that has great designs, that can latch you in, that can really just make you sit down and say, I want this unit, is a good thing. But being able to back that up with good mechanics, good gameplay, that doesn't necessarily make you feel like you're inclined to play constantly like Genshin Impact does with its fear of missing out, but instead makes you just want to come back regularly, or at least semi-consistently, to play the game because you enjoy the gameplay loop itself. You don't necessarily need a strong start, you just need a strong game, a strong foundation. I think a good story can be fixed later on. I think good stories can be made up for later on. You could do what I did, which is not care about the story itself until you meet a character that you actually care about, and that inclines you to learn more about it. For Blue Archive, it was Izuna who really got me into the story because I like that character. For Genshin Impact, it was Zhongli. For Arknight, it's Golden Glow. There are so many different units that can really help pull you in and get you attached to not only characters in a story, but also the story and world itself. And I think that if you don't succeed at the beginning, you can definitely succeed in characterization. If I know a character's personality and everything else essentially matches up, or at least allows me to experience and learn more about that unit, it's perfectly fine. I would consider Arknights to be a great example of a game that started out really good and continues to excel and do extremely well. Arknights has a great community, it has a great gameplay loop, a great aesthetic. The OSTs for the game have been consistent from the beginning of the game's development all the way up into the current ones. The events are quite nice and generous. You have the units themselves that are really good. I haven't really seen or at least heard of an awful, terrible unit. And I think this really encompasses that a good game can make a great community, and a great community can encompass and assist a good game. I think when there's a discrepancy between how bad or how good the community is, it's also indicative of a problem with the game itself. So I would say, right now today, if you're looking for a good gacha game to play, I'd say Azur Lane, I'd say Arknights, I'd say casually pick up a Blue Archive, but I would not say pick up a Genshin Impact, because I don't think any of the other games that aren't really mentioned here are on the same level as Arknights. And I'm only mentioning the ones that I played. I'm not going to mention Girls Frontline because I haven't played that game yet. But that is my solid opinion on Arknights. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Tell me your opinion on Arknights. Do you play the game? Do you not play the game? Do you hate it? Do you like it? Or have you had extremely terrible interactions with the community itself? Either way, I hope to see you next time, and goodbye.